A short time ago, I met by chance an old acquaintance from Switzerland, a fairly high functionary of the International Red Cross. He had just come back from Beirut, where he was helping the many injured, sick, and hungry from among that city's Muslim population to adapt themselves to what promised to be a very shaky peace. While the three of us, he, my wife, and myself, were sitting over cups of coffee, our friend described his recent experiences in Beirut, and particularly the last terrible days of incessant Israeli bombardment of the city. And at the end, he narrated to us a curious incident. When that last ceasefire became a fact and the constant booming of artillery shells and the ear-splitting explosions of bombs stopped, I had the same feeling as I experienced once in Central America after a volcanic eruption and an earthquake, an eerie silence, or something that seemed to be silence to ears too long accustomed to shattering noise. I walked through an utterly destroyed, torn-up street, on both sides a rubble of houses, twisted iron girders, broken furniture, and indescribable heaps of rubbish, and over everything there floated a nauseating stench of decay. And then I noticed an old woman sitting on the ground, stony-faced and motionless. She looked at me but did not seem to see me, and stared unblinkingly ahead of her. I thought that she was wounded or ill, and asked her in my broken, rudimentary Arabic, "Can I help you? Can I do something for you?" She appeared to focus her eyes on me but did not answer my question. Instead, she nodded repeatedly and said, "They were fighting for Al-Quds." At that point of his narrative, our Swiss friend looked inquiringly at me. Al-Quds, I know, means Jerusalem in Arabic, but Jerusalem in Beirut? I cannot understand it to this day. Could she have meant the Palestinians? Of course, most of them were Muslims, but there were many Christians among them as well, and I know that Jerusalem is sacred to both of them. Or did she perhaps mean the Israelis, finding excuses for them in spite of her own hatred and desolation, in spite of herself? For she looked as if her words had been forced out of her. It is to resolve my friend's perplexity and to answer his question that I am writing these lines. As for myself, I have no doubt that the old woman had been referring to the Muslims, of whom she herself was obviously one, implying that they had been fighting for a cause that was sacred to them. But it is also possible that without knowing it, she instinctively gave utterance to the historic truth that the fight in and around Beirut was in a sense a fight for Jerusalem, or rather on one side for a justification of forcibly possessing it, and on the other a fight for retaining at least the moral claim to its possession. There is no denying that Jerusalem is sacred to the followers of all the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But there is a marked difference in their considerations of the reason for this city's sacredness. To the Jews, Jerusalem is primarily a symbol of their national past and their conviction of being God's chosen people by virtue of their descent from Abraham. Historically, it was the capital of the tiny kingdom which the Hebrews established in Palestine through conquest in the last millennium before the Christian era, and which, after a stormy independent or semi-independent existence of about 500 years, they lost to the Romans nearly 2,000 years ago. During most of the period of their independence, the Jews, bent upon securing and enlarging what they regarded as their patrimony, almost incessantly waged war against the people and tribe around them, and whenever they were victorious, they invariably, as the Bible tells us, destroyed the defeated enemy by fire and sword, killing indiscriminately all the men, women, and children who fell into their hands. And because all this was done on the grounds of their allegedly being God's chosen people, the Jews gradually acquired the habit of looking upon mankind's history with Jewish eyes alone. That is to say, they learned and forever continued to relate everything that happened in the world around them to themselves alone, with the rest of mankind being but a foil for the destinies of the chosen people. Consequently, the narrative of the Old Testament, in the form in which it appears today, represents to the Jews almost exclusively a history of the Jewish people. It is this point of view which explains their peculiar, passionate attachment to Jerusalem as the birthright of the children of Israel. In other words, it is not just a religious attachment but rather the outcome of a particular historical memory, and thus of a people's narcissistic self-adoration. To the Christians, on the other hand, Jerusalem has, apart from its Old Testament connotation, a genuine religious significance as the culminating point of the mission of Jesus, in the place in which, according to Christian doctrine, he is said to have been crucified and where he was supposed to have been buried. In a sense, therefore, the Christians too look upon Jerusalem with the eyes of history. But because the events with which that historical memory is associated were of a spiritual and not of a racial or national import, Jerusalem appears to a Christian not as a patrimony, but rather as something objectively holy, to be visited in pilgrimage or adored from afar, Not always, of course, from afar, for when at the end of the 11th century the Christian nations of Europe set out on the first of their crusades, their aim was to wrest Jerusalem and the entire Holy Land with it from the people whom they regarded as heathen, in a word, to possess it. Still, the time of the Crusades belonged to a faraway past, and no sensible Christian would today think of Jerusalem in terms of political possession or domination. But what about the Muslims? The Muslim attitude towards Jerusalem is at once ideological and historical. Ideological because it is based on the Quran, and historical because it arises from the fact of continuity in mankind's religious experience, which is a basic tenet of the Islamic faith, and specifically from the fact that most of the prophets revered as such by the Muslims lived and died in Palestine, the focal point of which is of course Jerusalem. All these elements have been clearly alluded to in the first verse of the 17th Surah of the Quran. Limitless in his glory is he who transported his servant Muhammad by night from the inviolable house of worship at Mecca to the remote house of worship at Jerusalem, the environs of which we had blessed. This Quranic reference to the Prophet Muhammad's experience of the night journey to Jerusalem expresses the inner connection between the message enunciated by him and the messages voiced by the earlier prophets, the names of most of whom appear already in the Bible. The remote, the farthest, Al-Aqsa, house of worship, is obviously the Temple of Solomon, or to phrase it more accurately, its site. Now Solomon, whom the Jews regarded as no more than a king, albeit a very successful and glorious king, is like his father David, revered by the Muslims as being one of the long line of God-inspired Hebrew prophets, beginning with Abraham and ending with Jesus, and because according to the Quran so many prophets had lived in the land surrounding the site on which Solomon built his temple, it is described in the Quran verse quoted above as blessed by God. This is also the reason why ever since the beginning of the Islamic period the Arabic name for Jerusalem has been Al-Bayt al-Muqaddas, the sacred house, or simply Al-Quds, sacredness, and why the Muslims revere it next to Mecca and Medina as one of their three holy cities. It is obvious, therefore, that the Muslim attitude towards Jerusalem, and of course Palestine as a whole, has nothing to do with an ancestral title to its possession. No Muslim claims descent from Solomon, the builder of what to the Arabs at the time of the Quranic revelation was the remote house of worship, but every Muslim reveres the memory of Solomon as a prophet. Similarly, although about a half of all Arabian tribes, and among them the tribe to which the Prophet Muhammad belonged, regarded Solomon's ancestor Abraham as their ancestor as well, no Muslim attributes to this race relationship any intrinsic importance. Contrary to the Jews, who venerate Abraham primarily as their patriarch, that is to say, as one of the progenitors of their race, to the Muslims his memory is sacred on purely religious grounds. It is sacred because Abraham was one of the most sublime of God's apostles, the man who, as the Quran so graphically describes it in the 6th Surah, attained to inner illumination and an instinctive insight into the truth of God's oneness and uniqueness without any external guidance, the prototype of the God-seeker who reaches his goal because his heart and mind drive him to it. Hence, it is not difficult to understand why the Prophet Muhammad, while in Mecca during the early years of his mission, used to turn his face towards Jerusalem whenever he prayed. To him, as to every Muslim after him, Jerusalem was a sacred place, and it remained sacred even after the Quranic revelation which years later established the Kaaba in Mecca, described as the inviolable house of worship, as the direction towards which the followers of the Quran should turn their faces in prayer. No wonder, then, that when Jerusalem was conquered by the Arabs in the 7th century of the Christian era, the city was treated by its Muslim conquerors with all the reverence due to its religious status. By then, there was no Jewish population there. The last Jews had been expelled by the Romans centuries earlier. But the Christian inhabitants of the city were granted by the Arabs an assurance of full security for their lives, their property, and their places of worship. In short, a true covenant of peace and protection. Consequently, after the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, no church was converted into a mosque, and wherever a new mosque was built, the Muslim administrators took care not to encroach upon the rights of the indigenous communities, and when it was decided to build a great new mosque in Jerusalem, every precaution was taken not to erect the building on a place already occupied by another house of worship. Now Solomon's temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC, and its successor, the temple built by Herod the Great at the beginning of the Christian era, had been turned into a heap of rubble by the soldiers of Titus in the year 70 of that era. And so the great mosque, ever since known by the Quranic name of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, was built on that empty but sacred place in commemoration of the first verse of the 17th Surah, and thus of all the prophets who preceded the last one through whom the Quran was revealed. Throughout the centuries that followed, with an interruption of less than 100 years caused by the Crusades and the Frankish occupation of Palestine, the Quranic doctrine of mankind's religious continuity was the basis for all social life in the Holy Land. Under Muslim rule, the sacredness of Jerusalem was expressed in its openness to the followers of all the three monotheistic religions. The existing Christian churches and monasteries of all denominations were protected, and many more were gradually built. The few Jews who had gradually returned had no temple of their own because they believed that only the Messiah, who, according to their creed, would appear at the end of time, would be entitled to rebuild the destroyed Temple of Solomon and restore it to its ancient glory. Nonetheless, they had their own houses of prayer and were free to worship in front of the last remainder of the Herodian Temple, the so-called Wailing Wall, which the Muslims had left untouched. And as the centuries came and went, pilgrims from all the three communities freely mingled in the ancient streets of Al-Quds, the city that was holy to all of them. And then came the establishment of Israel, and 2 decades later the War of 1967, in the course of which the Israelis gained physical possession of the old city of Jerusalem. This did not theoretically signify any change in the sacredness of the holy city, as in past centuries Christian pilgrims continued to flock to Jerusalem and the other shrines connected with the memory of Jesus. Muslim pilgrims too could in theory visit all the places which so vividly recalled to them most of the prophets mentioned in the Quran, and naturally enough the last prophet Muhammad, with his mystic experience intimately bound up with the remote house of worship in Jerusalem. In practice, however, Muslim pilgrims were and are to this day not encouraged to visit the land which all of them still call Palestine, for the simple reason that they still insist on regarding Jerusalem as a universal holy city, whereas the Israeli parliament has years ago declared that no part of the now forcibly reunited city of Jerusalem would ever be returned to the Arabs, and that the city as a whole would forever remain the eternal capital of the State of Israel. This undisguised return to the Old Testament conception of Jerusalem as the exclusive patrimony of the Jewish people betrays, of course, a total disregard of a most important lesson of history and philosophy, the lesson that in human affairs there is no such thing as never or always or forever, and that eternity is an attribute to God alone. The very name of the ancient city of Al-Quds, the holy, implies that it cannot be considered a patrimony or a birthright of this or that nation, and certainly not a piece of real estate to be possessed by any one group of people. It belongs to all who mentally approach it with a humility born of faith in the one God, and particularly to those who, in the words of the Quran, believe in all his apostles, making no distinction between any of them. Since Jerusalem is universal in its religious significance and cannot therefore be conceded as a patrimony to any one nation, is it not probable that its political destiny too will not be decided in the city itself, but elsewhere, not in and by an Israeli parliament, but in a far wider arena? Was this perhaps the meaning of the visionary words which the old woman sitting amidst the ruins of Beirut spoke in the hearing of my Swiss friend? They were fighting for Al-Quds.